Let's bring in Jamelle Bouie and Julie Pace in our Washington bureau. Jamelle is a CBS News political analyst and chief political correspondent for Slate. And Julie is Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press. Welcome to you both. More on Steve Bannon in a moment, but we heard Senator Tim Scott, Jamelle, questioning whether the president can regain his moral authority. In what ways does a president need, quote unquote, moral authority to advance his agenda?
I think he needs to be able to bring the entire American public on to sort of his more expansive and sometimes controversial agenda goals. And if he does not have that moral authority, that becomes very difficult. The fact of the matter is that the moment President Trump entered office, he entered office with a tremendous amount of opposition and skepticism from large parts of the American public. And since January 20th, he has done very little to counter or convince those skeptics and those opponents that he isn't what they thought he might be. All the events surrounding Charlottesville and the statements last Saturday and this past Tuesday add to that. And in fact, I think they may serve to be an irreversible or begin an irreversible decline from among those groups of people. I'm not sure it is possible for him to bring those people into the fold and convince them that he has the moral authority to lead them.
Julie, what do you think? Is it too late?
Well, look, he's in an early stage of his presidency, but I do think that increasingly perspectives on the Trump presidency have already been shaped. If you are someone who was opposed to him from the start, he's given you nothing, as Jamelle said, to latch on to. There's nothing either on the leadership side, being sort of that moral leader for the country that might be able to sway you, and there's nothing really on the policy side, because we've seen that the Republican-led Congress has really struggled to get anything significant passed. So it's hard as president to change opinions generally, but for someone like this president who came in and was already so divisive and was already so loathed by his opponents, it's really difficult to imagine how he sways them going forward. So then the real challenge for Trump becomes holding on to the people who did support him in the election. And what we've seen in a number of recent polls is that while his support among Republicans is still significant, it is starting to inch back a little bit. And that's worrisome if you're President Trump, because he needs every single Republican voter that he can get to side with him. He's clearly not growing with Democrats. He's not growing with independents. If he starts to lose support among Republican voters, then it's a pretty worrisome position for him.
Julie, let me ask you, your AP colleague Bill Barrow has an interesting story this weekend about the Democratic response to Charlottesville, writing, quote, "Democrats are in a quandary, how to seize the moral high ground without getting sucked into a politically perilous culture war." What are the risks, Julie, for Democrats of being absorbed in a culture war?
Well, we've seen this happen a couple times with Democrats. Something like what we saw last week happens, and in general, this is a pretty easy place for a politician of either party to come out and condemn white supremacists. That's what made Trump's reaction so stunning. But Democrats know that they do have a risk in overreaching here, that you can't run on these social issues alone, and you can't run on an anti-Trump message alone. That was one of the clear lessons learned from 2016, and it's one of the reasons that Democrats have said going into 2018 that they really need to lock into a clear economic message. The problem is that when these events like we just saw come up again, that is the easier territory to start fighting on. The economic message is still tricky for Democrats. It is something that they are still struggling with the left and the center of their own party to really hone in on. So Democratic activists that I talked to this past week were quite energized, but Democrats who I talked to who were working on some of the 2018 campaigns were a little more nervous about the party going sort of full steam ahead on the aftermath of Charlottesville, and perhaps ignoring this reality that they still lack a clear economic message heading into the midterms.
Jamelle, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this? How do you see this particular landscape for Democrats?
The simple truth is that Democrats, to win a House majority or a Senate majority, are going to have to win over some of those white working voters, white suburban voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And some number, maybe most of those voters, probably are unhappy with the president's statements on Charlottesville, but also aren't eager about taking down Confederate monuments, may see them as heritage, may see them as things that need to stand. And so for Democrats who have an activist base who very much want to take down those Confederate monuments, that becomes a difficult terrain to manage. You can sort of see this right now in Virginia with the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Ralph Northam, who very much wants to avoid this conversation, even as Democrats in the state are moving towards a position of taking down Confederate statues across the state. And I imagine that is part of the core difficulty. I'm actually not entirely sure that looking to 2018, a very substantive economic message is necessary. The GOP in its 2010 and 2014 gains didn't have much of a message beyond vote for us to stick it to Barack Obama. And I think that an anti-Trump message may actually be sufficient for a midterm election, but I think it is true that having an economic message enables the party to approach situations like Charlottesville without getting bogged down in a kind of culture war frame.
We'll continue to watch their approach. Meantime, Julie, we've talked about the ideological battles between Steve Bannon and other West Wing officials. But does Bannon's departure actually signal more strength for the centrists and the so-called globalists in the White House?
I don't think we know yet. I think that what is striking, though, is that Bannon's departure does leave the White House with no one really inside besides the president himself, who's quite important in this conversation, who really is grounded in the ideology that Trump ran on. A lot of the things that Trump is talking about, like immigration, he was almost taught by Steve Bannon in the years leading up to his presidential bid. But on other issues like trade, this is something that Trump has been talking about for years, this idea of a trade war with China, bringing more jobs back to the U.S. and the impact of massive trade deals on the U.S. economy. So on that front, I don't know if you're going to see a huge shift just because Bannon is gone, but it gives an opportunity for the more moderate, in some cases, the Democrats who are in this administration to stake their claim. But I think what is so striking about this right now is the fact that we are 7 months into the presidency and we're actually having a debate over what kind of ideology this president is going to have and what kind of policies he's going to push. That is so different. You could talk about past presidents who veered a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left within the construct of their own party. This is a president who is really unmoored when it comes to ideology on several major issues.
Yeah, Jamel, let me ask you. Julie uses the word unmoored. Other people would say that's flexibility. What do you think the departure of Steve Bannon means for this West Wing?
I mean, flexibility would make sense if this were a West Wing that were fully staffed, that had sort of a clear strategy in mind, that had particular goals in mind, and that was led by a president who sort of had command of both his White House and his administration and had strong working relationships with Congress. In that case, the departure of someone like Bannon may be seen as sort of a strategic concession to be able to get things done. But we don't have that. The striking thing about this administration at 7 months, to echo Julie here, is that it is still in disarray. It is still understaffed. It is still unclear, even when Bannon was there, what its broader strategy was, what its goals were. And so Bannon's departure, I think, more than anything, is indicative of these really major weaknesses within the Trump administration and with the Trump White House. And looking ahead to September, when we have to fund the government, there's the debt ceiling, it raises this real question of, is the Trump White House able to marshal its resources and marshal a plan for dealing with what may end up being a very fraught, intense set of negotiations? And it's unclear whether or not that's the case.
Well, given what you just said, how did both of you interpret Steve Bannon's comment that, quote, the Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over? Julie, let me start with you.
It was such a striking comment. It really signaled Bannon's frustration, I think, with the Gary Cohn, sort of Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner wing of this White House, and this feeling that there are people that could be pushing the president in a different direction. And what makes Bannon so potentially dangerous for the White House and for Trump himself is the platform that he has going back to Breitbart, where you can bet that every time the president makes a decision that is counter to something he promised in the campaign, or or that doesn't fulfill something he promised in the campaign, Breitbart, led by Bannon, is going to be right there to call it out, in a pretty aggressive way.
Jamelle, what did you think of that comment? The Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over.
Yeah, so it's clear that Steve Bannon is an ideological person. He has a well-defined ideology. And it's also clear that there are a lot of ways in which Donald Trump is simpatico with that ideology. They both sort of, they're nationalists, both committed to a certain kind of identity politics among white Americans, so on and so forth. So there's those connections there. But I think Donald Trump isn't at core an ideological person. He seems to have impulses, he seems to have desires, but he doesn't really seem to have any systematic thinking. And so I think Steve Bannon imagined that electing Donald Trump would enable him to actualize his ideology, which is sort of like a cultural nationalism and economic nationalism, and bring that to the White House. But with Trump, we have someone who seems much more interested in kind of bolstering his personal standing, in sort of, frankly, helping his family businesses get stronger financial securing. Someone who wants to exploit the trappings of the presidency, but isn't necessarily interested in the actual job of the presidency. And you see that in the fact that Trump, for key positions, appointed people with whom he is familiar, with whom he knows, whom fit a certain milieu that he is used to, but that don't necessarily track with the ideology that he ran on and that Bannon thought he was bringing to the White House. And so I think that's what Bannon means, that in a critical way, he made a misjudgment about the kind of person Donald Trump was and the kind of presidency he might expect.
All right, we'll be watching closely to see what this week brings. Jamelle Bouie and Julie Pace, thank you both so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thanks, Elaine.